Guys, I'm so excited to dive into identity capital. Also, if you're new here, I'm Megan Smilerberg. Guys is a gender neutral term over here. Anyone can be a guy in that respect. Do you feel me? Today, we're gonna dive into the first half of James E. Coates. Actually, James E. Cote. And he's from Ontario, so it's definitely French. The first half of his paper. It's called Identity Capital, Social Capital, and the Wider Benefits of Learning, Generating Resources Facilitative of Social Cohesion. Now, my inspiration for breaking down these research papers is that a lot of the times can struggle with reading comprehension, but not only that, do I struggle with reading comprehension or are things just written in a gatekeepy way that make it hard for people to digest what's actually being said? Now, luckily, James did a great job of writing this out. At least in the first half, I digested it quite well. It was also the first thing I like. I woke up, I rolled over, I turned on the coffee, I started reading. So, and I made some toast with eggs. So, I think a fresh mind absolutely helps. But when I talk about it in as highlight, I got things to tell you. So, first, let me tell you that Identity Capital first came to my world through TikTok, as many things do, which is why, man, I just love this app so much. This woman, I'll make sure I include the TikTok in here in the digest. She talked about identity capital and how there are four layers of identity capital. Firstly, let me tell you the definition of identity capital is basically all of the things that make you you, all of the things that form and create your identity. So that could be, yes, your job, your career for sure, your school, where you went to school, your education, your degrees, of course, but also your hobbies, your interests, your travels, where you like what you like to do in your spare time, because those all speak to your identity, right? Those are all the things that have formed your identity, where you grew up, how you grew up, right? Those all play a part. So there are apparently four layers of identity capital. One is narrative capital, the story we choose to tell about our journey, as well as the meaning we create from the chaos. I really like narrative capital. If you know, you know. Capability capital, not just skills, but adaptability, reflection, emotional depth, systems thinking, and futures literacy. That's interesting, futures literacy. I'm going to interpret futures literacy as your capacity to plan for the future, maybe, interpret what the future may look like for yourself. That's what I think anyway, or could look like for yourself. Relational capital, the people who challenge, expand, and redefine our sense of self. Experiential capital, the transitions, moves, risks, and life events that shape us. So in summary, four layers of identity capital: narrative capital, capability capital, relational capital, experiential capital, right? In this paper, James is exploring identity capital, social capital, and the wider benefits of learning. All right, with that said, we're going to dive in. Bear with me because I have all the thoughts, I have all the notes. And I was like, do I read this and pause and talk to them and pause? And I said, no, let me read the first half and then come back to you. So, essentially, we're going to dive into two terms, and these two terms are related to basically how we grow up as children, right? And particularly how we phase into adulthood. Um, Apparently, a lot of James's research and talks around identity capital was from the perspective of disadvantaged youth. I would consider myself to fall into that category, and how these disadvantaged youth can create opportunity for themselves through identity capital. And a lot of what's said in here, whoa, I didn't even know I didn't even know this, to be honest. Like, I dove in, I said, "Oh my god, I see a lot of myself in this." And so I find it really fascinating, and I'm going to, at the end of this, I'll have some prompts for you to ask you about how you see yourselves in different pieces or different terms and how they relate to maybe your upbringing or your life now and what you see within yourself. But especially also if you are an educator, a practitioner, just anyone who loves the youth, I think a lot of this is really helpful to keep in mind. And so the two terms we're going to talk about are in relation to the lack of support for the acquisition of key resources associated with optimal identity development. And so the terms that we're going to dive into are cultural destructuring, which was fascinating, and individualization, which you can probably guess what individualization means, but we're going to dive into it. And so, yeah, let me just expose it myself and tell you how I see myself in this, and hopefully it'll help you to digest it. All right. So cultural deconstruction is basically the deconstruction of your culture, right? So for example, traditions, your norms, your values, your beliefs. And basically the way that I interpret this is um cultural norms from my parents have been deconstructed and they aren't as relevant now. And what that means is my parents then can't provide guidance to me in regards as I build my identity, right? As I individualize, as I build my identity capital, my parents are of less value to me in that way, which is facts, which is facts. My parents, to be honest, weren't really they taught me how to present myself. But even that, for some context, I grew up in a Black American family where your appearance and your presentation was very important. On one hand, we're vain, and I like that. No one tells me that I'm beautiful as often as my parents, and that's always been the case. And so, on one hand, it's vanity. On the other, it's like confidence. It's a boost for sure, right? The other side of it, though, that from my parents' perspective, is I remember one time I was like 15 or 16 and I had to go to work. And so I was at my dad's house. My dad had to bring me back to my mom so I can change and drive me to work across town. And I hopped out the car to go into the gas station. I had pajamas on. And for, how people talk about people wearing pajamas to the airport and da da da, I could never wear pajamas outside that house. Like it was never a thing. I only put pajamas on because I was going from his house to the car to my mom's house to change, back in the car, and then to Burger King to go work my shift, right? But I happened to hop out, and he went off on me like, oh my gosh, how could you? On one hand, it's being presentable, and that part of it I'm with. Like I still don't go outside in pajamas. The other side of it though with my parents is that they come from a very different time where as Black people, particularly with my parents growing up in Boston, you present to yourself a certain way so that you would be treated a certain way, right? And not just treated favorably, treated in the sense that people wouldn't be racially aggressive toward you. I can listen. The stories my parents have told me about growing up in Boston. Oh my God. So yes, that was such a big piece of their lives growing up, and then also the generations that raised them and the generations that raised them. Right, it was really important for you as a Black person to present yourself in a certain way in different environments. Whereas for me, I don't hold that same societal pressure anymore. Right, so that's where there's a bit of a disconnect, if you will. Okay, this piece I found fascinating. So a lot of what he says about cultural destructuring, he says relates back to capitalism. So capitalism thrives on cultural destructuring because it paves the way for new social patterns conducive to the consumption of new commodities. An example of this could be what he's saying is like capitalism. Okay. Capitalism thrives on cultural destructuring. And basically, we know that cultural destructuring ties back to our parents not necessarily being able to help us individualize or, let's say, create identity capital in regards to our career, which was my case. I'm a first generation college grad. My dad graduated from high school. My mom didn't. Or maybe, yeah, my mom didn't. But so that means that I was kind of just, thrown out there, right? This means through cultural destructuring that I, for example, am more likely to fall trap to the idea of a career coach. I just started working with a career coach, for example. That is capitalistic, right? I'm paying for a service to make up for the gap that was caused by cultural destructuring. You feel me? So he ties a lot of this back to capitalism and how capitalism again thrives because with cultural destructuring, you're more likely to need or be easily encouraged to consume a new commodity. In this case, the new commodity is career coaching. Let's see. He also mentions when this happens, the intergenerational social capital of communities can decline, as parents can provide fewer networks for their children to make the passage to a productive adulthood. And for me, that meant that luckily my parents chose to raise me in Providence, 45 minutes away from Boston. I moved there as a baby. And I was put in a place where, for example, my second grade teacher, Miss Pina, um, she's who advocated for me to go into gifted programs. A lot of my teachers advocated for me, but my parents also listened, particularly my mom, and my dad used to go clubbing with her. So my parents, by moving, put me in a position where I would be in community with people who could help me more, even though they necessarily couldn't be the ones to help me more. What else does he say? Market influences can set in motion forces that put the onus on the individual to compensate for diminished parental guidance to adult roles by adopting their own values and identities. I resonate with this so much because he mentioned such societies, meaning the society that we're speaking of right now, right? In this context of think of younger Megan, such societies usually become more anomic and individualistic. I looked up anomic. Anomic means societal abandonment of social bonds, norms, and moral guidance. And this leads to alienation and uncertainty within individuals. And that was mentioned, the alienation piece was mentioned by this, I think a guy, his name is Emil Durkheim. And he is who, I guess, studied like anomic and individualistic behavior or something. But I really relate to this because um, essentially, to be like, yeah, let's keep it honest, and mind you, I'm telling you about my perspective and how I fit into this, hoping that this will help you to contextualize what's being said because it's kind of a lot, right? I felt like I was in trouble a lot as a teenager, and I can see how this played into the people I allowed into my life later on. I felt like I was in trouble for bridging the gap for myself, you know? And what that has turned into is, again, relationships in the future. Sometimes I feel like people are mad at me or upset because they can't show up for me in the way that I need. And so it's easier to blame me for having the needs than it is to take responsibility for the fact that they cannot show up for me or cannot provide, like, cannot fill the gap themselves. And that's representative of my relationship with my parents. I wholeheartedly feel now looking back because, again, I hustled. I worked like 3 jobs in high school. I was on every exec board. I managed a team of 20 at the age of 17. I was board secretary. I was speaking in front of the mayor. I was doing so much. And in some regards, I kind of felt like I was punished for doing so much, but I was doing so much because I had to create a way out, right? And I'm an overachiever too. I enjoyed doing all the things, but it was a lot. Whew, my gosh. Um, so that's how I interpreted that piece, particularly again, how Emil said the alienation and uncertainty within individuals. And I still, not struggle, but I'm learning to build a relationship with uncertainty because on one hand, uncertainty and the unknown can feel really fun. When you grow up not knowing how bills are paid, that's not fun. It doesn't feel fun. Let me tell you, when you grow up not knowing where the next meal is, or if you're going home after school and if there's going to be food in the fridge, uncertainty and the unknown are not things that you build a fun relationship with. And so that's something I'm working on now. And so, yeah, I really get that piece in particular. Okay, let's keep going. Now we're going to talk about, so his piece on cultural destructuring was really short. Much more in depth and like a bigger piece of identity capital is individualization. So for example, he starts off by saying, actually, yeah, let me just read this whole beginning passage to you. The most obvious economic influence is the collapse of the youth labor market in many countries, making it difficult for those in their late teens and early 20s to secure employment that is sufficiently well paid to help them make the transition to adult independence. This is from 2005. And this is so relevant right now with Gen Z, right? Wild. It's also interesting because if you know, living at home with your parents is cultural. And having spent so much time abroad, um, Americans, in the sense of the US, are definitely, I would say, looked down upon or antagonized for the fact that it's like you leave the house when you hit a certain age. But I also was never like kicked out. I know that's a thing too. Like they say, apparently with different cultures, like you turn 18 and your parents kick you out. I cannot fathom. But if I wanted to go home now, my mom would say, please, come home. But I never took it as a pressure to leave the home. I ran at 18, like to go to college, and then I think it's fun. So I don't know. All that to say, there's still I can see how like there's a cultural lens to what he's saying, right? Because in a lot of cultures, it's not even expected that you would leave the house. But just because you leave the house or not, or yeah, whether you leave the house or not doesn't necessarily speak to your adult independence, right? So he says many young people over the past couple of decades have found themselves in the paradoxical situation of needing parental financial support at the same time that their parents are less able to provide normative guidance. I relate to this because even now, right, if something went down, okay, I can go home. Even just last year, I spent like 8 months at home. Um, because I was transitioning my whole business. I was changing everything. I'm here now, right? I get to read research papers for a living. So I did the thing, but I had to deprogram and I had to rest. But also while my thank goodness my family was able to financially provide for me in that way, keep food in the fridge, right? I'm fed, I have a bed, I'm warm, all my needs are pretty much taken care of aside from like my bills for, my squares, my website and things like that. They weren't able to advise me though on next steps, and nor have they ever been able to advise me on next steps. You feel me? So that's how I interpreted what he's speaking to right there. I can really relate. um as a group, and he says like there are exceptions, parents have become more of a financial safety net than a strong normative influence, at least with respect to many issues that are key to identity formation, like career choice, political and religious beliefs, lifestyle preferences, and the like. My lifestyle looks nothing like my parents. My mom, it took to, if you know, you know, you go home and man, I used to try and work remotely. They didn't get it. And I was thinking, what are you doing in there? Meanwhile, I'm telling her, I come out and say, I just signed a client. She's like, what are you doing in that room? Right? That's a lifestyle preference. Or even me living abroad the way I did when I first started doing this. Now, mind you, my mom forgets. She'd be like, yes. So many parents are like, oh my God, can you believe my kid is doing da da da? Like, who are you? Do you don't forget I made you. I made you this. She forgets that when I first started, my mom was more so fear based. My dad was more so come home and get a real job. Meanwhile, who cares? I'm so grateful I didn't listen because even now, like, who cares about a real job? What is that? Um, Career choice. My parents couldn't help me with career choices, even though they tried to. Even my dad was like, bro, the job you're telling me to come home to, where did I go to college for? you know? Political and religious beliefs. Politically, I align with my parents, particularly my mom for sure, always. I was raised in a very you take care of people, and yeah, that's my political belief, is that as we're a community and we take care of each other. Religious though, my mom is the less religious of the two. My dad's very religious and I've never been. So again, I'm more spiritual than religious, and they weren't able to, my mom a little bit, but they weren't able to advise me on those things. Those are conclusions I came to on my own through my lived experiences. And it's okay. I think a lot of things in our lives we come to later on through our lived experiences. But conversely, it's like, oh, can we get help on just a few things though, other than finances, right? Um, yeah. Okay, let's see what else. He also mentioned, I didn't he mentioned this like earlier in the paper, I forget where, but he was talking about how capitalism capitalism as we know it adds to this rift between the parent and the child. And the example he gave, at first I didn't understand what he was saying, and then he gave the example of, how you see a toy commercial and the the messaging is like, go bug your parents for this, which is facts, because I know as a kid, I don't know that I probably did it. I probably did it, but I know my brother definitely did. But it's like you go pester your parents, right, until they buy that thing. That creates a relational rift between the parent and the child. And I never thought about that. And so a lot of what he's saying with identity capital as well is creating an identity that is less susceptible to marketing tactics like this. And he calls them like corrosive marketing tactics, which are a side effect of capitalism, right? Okay, this piece I particularly love. All right, let me read you a little bit. So basically he's talking about how it serves us, which, I mean, if you know me, you know, why be domestic when I can be global? So a lot of this is just so validating. And mind you, again, I didn't even know a lot of these conclusions are based upon disadvantaged youth and how they can create identity capital or rather how they can curate their identity capital in order to create more opportunities for themselves, which is literally what I have done by far. Because it's not just personality. Again, at school, I've always said that I'm a name whore. You know, if my college, like if you know my college, you know my college. The places I worked for, if you know their names, you know their names. I've always been intentional in that way. That was identity capital, and I didn't even know it. So he talks about part of the complexity that young people must face and attempt to master as market influences have reduced local bases of livelihood, meaning what does Providence have to offer me? And does Providence have enough opportunity? Providence is my hometown, by the way. Does Providence have enough opportunity for me to thrive there, right? So reduce local bases of livelihood is how to move from the local context in which they were raised and feel most secure to more impersonal context in which they function with a certain degree of confidence and competence, meaning are they able to leave an unfamiliar environment and still feel confident and what they have to offer and within their identity capital. This transition from a locally based identity to an identity that can incorporate demands from a large number of sometimes distant sources represents a relatively new challenge for more and more members of upcoming generations to face. Mind you, again, this is from 2005. This is from 21 years ago, and it's so relevant now. I'm going to keep reading you this piece, and then we'll dive into it. As the old locally based sources of livelihood and community disappear, meaning it used to be so very right, it's like it's down to your block, it's down to your neighborhood, that's where the opportunities are. Now this was before Zoom, so I wonder if he's still alive, because does he even know what's going on now, right? I built a whole business off of Instagram stories. As the old locally based sources of livelihood and community disappear, so too do the bases for adult identities predicated on them. Unless the person can learn how to take steps away from the comfort zones of the local, often only found in family and peer circles. And if you don't have any opportunity in those family and peer circles, what ends up happening, I don't know, or are you forced to live a life that's not as fruitful as the one that you could if you had more resources? I don't know. Their life course prospects can be very limited, and they may live their lives among the growing number of impoverished people found within most countries. It's like, again, the job that my dad wanted to offer me. My dad was saying, "Hey, come home from Thailand to make 50K a year." What? Um, the concern explored below is that as corporations interfere with the socialization process and replace parental normative guidance, the young will not be prepared for this challenge cognitively, emotionally, or moral ethically. And I definitely think that there's a lot to be said too, at least something I've seen in men. Mm, something I've seen in men is they leave their local community. And in this case, let's not, think of local just not as like a physical space, right? Local community meaning what's familiar, meaning like-minded people around them. As they leave those local communities and then they say things that they think are widely accepted, then they meet a Megan that says, "What are you talking about?" Right? That's the moral ethic. That's the moral ethical disconnect that he's talking about. Or rather, that's how I'm choosing to interpret it, because it's something I've witnessed quite a bit. They leave, you know, this small town in the States and they go live in Medellin and they're talking out loud and people are thinking, whoa, you need to stop talking. Um, okay, so now let's dive in real quick. I really appreciate that within this paper, he stops to talk about resources, because again, we're talking about capital, and he does stop to explain what capital is and some different types of capital. Um, Social scientists have tended to conceptualize resources in terms of metaphors based on the idea of capital, which literally refers to sources of profit, advantage, and power, as well as net assets and resources. Some scholars prefer not to speak in terms of any such metaphors, while others use just one capital concept, such that all personal resources are called cultural capital or human capital or social capital. So all he's saying is, he's kind of an anomaly basically by doing this whole identity capital thing, is what he's saying. He's just saying capital just means it's a collection of resources, right? And assets. Let's say assets, because I look at it as assets actually. So think of capital to mean assets. And then what he's saying is some economists and social scientists, they will diversify how they categorize these assets. Some have social assets. Some have cultural assets, right? Some know, a lot of them, he's saying, they just stick to one. So they say human assets, social assets, cultural assets. They keep it at that. And some choose to diversify, which I'm that type of economist. I'm definitely that type of social scientist. I prefer to specify different types of assets rather than lumping them all together. But one or the other is not better. But something to keep in mind as you go out into the world and maybe read more about identity capital, identity assets, right? Just know that some people or some readings and research papers may actually be speaking to identity assets, identity capital, but they're not calling it that. So it's up to you to interpret whether or not it falls into that category or not. Basically, now you're the social scientist and you get to decide. So he then dives into, he talks a bit about human capital and identity capital. I didn't even highlight anything in here. But really all it made me think of was the humanities and humanism. It also made me realize that I went to a liberal arts college and I didn't realize that both of I majored in economics and a double majored in economics and French. And I didn't realize until reading this that both of those fall within the humanities, which probably sounds very duh, Megan. But I've been told I'm not observant sometimes. And so I was like, oh, those are both humanities. Because I thought about how my senior year, my thesis for French, we had to write about a different type of humanism. And I wrote about Afro-humanism, and I have tried so hard to find the paper. Because mind you, it was like 15 to 25 pages entirely in French. Like, how was I doing this? I don't know. Um, and I wish I could find it, but we had to choose a different type of humanism to write about. That's all I really thought about here. But all he says is the concept of human capital is a metaphor introduced by economists to account for the characteristics of people that are productive in some economic context, like educational attainment or specific technical skills. Some scholars feel that the concept of human capital is all that is needed to account for the wherewithal necessary to function in industrial capitalist societies. Interesting. It is really unnecessary and ill-advised to rubber sheet the concepts like that because it reduces both its conceptual clarity and scientific utility. Okay, I feel that. It's also a concept developed to account for conditions in modernity more so than in late modernity. He's saying that he thinks it's like irresponsible and lazy, basically, to lump everything under human capital. He's like, no, there is so much more than that. And basically, why would we just keep it to just that? That's what he's saying. So now let's jump ahead because, he talks about social capital and identity capital. And if you know me, social capital is my favorite form of currency. Social capital is definitely something I have intentionally leveraged in my life for opportunities. And I'm very mindful of who I associate with. I'm very mindful of the reputation that people or that I built by having certain people around me. I'm very mindful of who brings me what types of opportunities and who feeds my mind in different ways. And so social capital has always been a very huge piece of my life in regards to economic mobility. And it's something even as a kid, I've just always been really mindful of and mindful to be around people who represent my integrity, basically. And so I didn't get an answer to this before I dive in, but I put a question here and I said, is language part of social capital? Hold on, let me see what the internet thinks. Oh, tingles. So firstly, I found a paper. We may have to dive into this next time. It's called Language as Social Capital. Apparently, language is a critical component of social capital, often referred to as linguistic capital. Jizz, oh my gosh. Apparently there are also 5 types of social capital. Whatever, we'll get into that next time. But my question about that, about language as social capital, is because I know whenever I wanted to transition into a new space, particularly professionally, really my only hindrance is language, you know? And that's something I'm dealing with now, in that I'm transitioning to using my skills in a different way, because that's really usually all I'm doing is just my skills are translating to a different arena. And the gap, though, the barrier, not even to say it's a barrier of entry, maybe it's a barrier of comprehension on my end, is the language. And that's why I was curious about language as social capital, because also even me learning French has been a big piece of my social capital. I can, or even just learning languages, I can enter way more rooms. I always say I can make more friends if I speak more languages. The more languages I speak, the more strangers I get to talk to, but also the more rooms I get to show up in and express myself and really highlight and show my personality outside of English. Um, so he says, as noted, capital refers to net assets and resources. In this case, hold on, let me read the whole thing. Some assets are tangible in the sense that they are socially visible or relational, contingent on interpersonal relationships rather than being the exclusive property of persons, meaning these are social cap. This is social capital, right? These include such things as group memberships and various statuses, so age, gender, race, that can function as passports into different social and institutional spheres. I love that he framed it as a passport. It's like black privilege. Some people say that black privilege isn't a thing, which is, I think, insane. Even just seeing how I'm received when I travel versus other Americans. Yeah, but I love that he phrased it as a passport. um so then if we think of these passports, right? And how we talked about identity capital and how what was it? It's individualization, and how our parents may not be able to help us in self-actualizing basically that's what it is, right? That our parents may not be able to help us self-actualize in a way that's beneficial to us as we enter into the real world, as we'll say. This speaks to what happens when there is or isn't intergenerational social capital. As I mentioned with my parents, right, moving me to Providence, that was a way of them affording me social capital in a way that they may not have been able to provide in Boston within their natural, like in their current network, right? They may not have had, they probably didn't though, have people who could have really nourished me. So they moved me into a different location to basically compensate for the lack of social capital that they had in Boston. They put me in a different spot. So this is speaking to the lack of intergenerational social capital. Excuse me. Oh, excuse me. The more specific concept of intergenerational social capital refers to the quid pro quo between parents and their progeny, and the ability of the parental generation to transfer functional values and facilitative networks to the offspring generation. It's interesting he says the ability of the parental generation rather than, I feel, the responsibility. And what if parents started looking at it as a responsibility? Maybe they'd be less likely to have kids, right? Rather than saying it as an option for how you can help your child, why not take it as a responsibility on how you can help your child? But then also that goes into, do they have the ability to even recognize that they're lacking social capital? That's another, right? Um, So basically, it's saying the bond of this quid pro quo is unconditional, meaning the parents they're obligated, right, to do this. However, this unconditional bond is threatened by the corrosive market influences like forms of predatory marketing that set children against parents for the sake of commodity consumption. Now, to be honest, I don't know here necessarily how this relates, like how the corrosive market influences and the predatory marketing are related to unconditional quid pro quo and social capital. Let's read this again. The more specific concept of intergenerational social capital refers to the quid pro quo between parents and their progeny, and the ability of the parental generation to transfer functional values and facilitative networks to the offspring generation. I don't know. Let's jump ahead to something else tonight. It'll come later, I guess. Or maybe if you do get how those are related, hit me up and tell me. Um, Identity capital represents attributes associated with this with sets of psychosocial skills, largely cognitive in nature, that appear to be necessary for people to intelligently strategize and make decisions affecting their life courses. I don't know if I passed it yet. I think I did. Wait, did I? Oh man, I wonder if I did already. But there was a piece that talked about how Hmm. Oh man, I think it was in the beginning. Hold on. Okay, it was in the beginning. Let's jump back real quick. It was about cultural destructuring. And it was talking about basically when your parents can't guide you, right? They're culturally destructing because the norms can't go with you. Basically, the norms are irrelevant to this generation than like in a way that they were to the past one, right? This creates societies where you become more anomic, which I told you is societal abandonment of social norms and more likely to lead to alienation and uncertainty. And I mentioned how I felt alienated, right? And individualistic. And then mentioned in extreme forms, unregulated individualism can be deleterious for both the person and the form of identity problems and the community, sometimes manifested in crime and economic decline. To not go into it too much, the crime piece I really saw in my family. And that's why it just came to mind with the piece that we were just reading. I'm like, wow, that part in particular, because it's basically like, let's say your parents, were used to money being made a certain way, or also they too may be impoverished, right? So if they're in poverty, how can they help you to escape it, right? All they can do is help you to go toward the poverty. Um, but if they're giving you, even if they weren't in poverty, maybe they were thriving, but they were thriving in a different context. So if they can't help you thrive in this new context, in this new world, a lot of people may turn toward crime, right? To make up for that gap. Oh my gosh, fascinating. He also talks about how important it is to pay attention to how, different social environments influence identity capital, which makes sense. I mean, in the same way, if we think of when you do have kids, right? You think of being mindful of who their friends are. I know that's something my mom was very big on. Like, who are my friends? She always knew who all my friends were. If there was a certain type of influence, they were cut. They were cut very immediately, and I appreciate that. Looking back, my mom didn't play about that, and that those social environments are what help create, right, or hinder identity capital. Although I don't know that identity capital can be hindered rather than influenced, right, into appearing how it is to appear. Um, okay, there's a piece I want to tell you. So he says people should be more likely to develop senses of authorship over their own biographies, meaning encouraged to have the autonomy to create and write their own narrative capital, taking responsibility for their life choices and creating meaningful and satisfying lives for themselves and their significant others, as opposed to the consumer identity foisted by predatory marketers. True, because I guess like marketing in its essence, right, is influencing you to make certain decisions that benefit them, ideally a decision that leads to you spending money, rather than basically a coach versus an advisor, right? An advisor is there to tell you what to do. A coach, or a good coach anyway, is going to ask you questions in order for you to come to your own conclusions. The concept of identity capital can thus help us understand how individuals can attribute to social cohesion and the global community where involvements are not at the first order of bonding social capital, which requires personal involvements in a place, but rather at higher orders of involvement. Okay, this piece was really interesting because he talks, this is when he gets into places, right? And I get entirely what he means because I wrote in a spot about, I was thinking about how a lot of our networks are derivatives of a space. And when I come into a new room, for example, my social capital is higher by the like in relation to the number of ties I still have to these other spaces, right? To these different networks, to social capital was curated through these networks, right? Which are, so like if I come into a space and someone mentions, "Oh, I want to go to Tanzania." I say, "Oh, I have one of my a friend from my alma mater that I was a college friend. They live in Tanzania." That relationship was built upon a place, which was college. Um, and I actually think I wrote down a question when I was reading this about, I wonder how we update our definition of places and spaces to match 2026. And so like Well, actually, no, because even in this, he talks about the lack of face-to-face interaction. So he himself talks about how he put this research paper together and how he wrote this article through a lot of email communications. Um, he says how people located around the globe can create and sustain communities that involve very little face-to-face interaction. Actually, right now, you're watching this, but this is not face-to-face. This is you to my face. If you're watching, you still could also be listening, right? Um, hmm. And you still get the benefits of concrete communities, for example, career advancement, the generation of new knowledge, mutual senses of accomplishment, and so forth. Scholarly societies, now aided by instantaneous internet communications, are a good example of this. For example, I am writing this article as a result of email communications stimulated by the social capital of local networks in England that bridge to the international networks of which I am a member. And because of his identity capital as a researcher and a theorist, they want to talk to him. Identity capital tied to social capital. You get it? You get it. I get it. It's all. Um, the concept of identity capital helps us to understand the mental wherewithal that people can be possess as part of an agentic personality, the ability to move both concretely and abstractly among groups and networks with diverse interests, and the adaptive ability to combine diverse resources as the situation dictates. Meaning, I go into a room, maybe the room is full of world travelers, so I can switch to French. Or maybe I can talk about my time in Thailand. Or maybe I can talk about how I'm going to grad school in France. Or maybe they mention that while they travel, they also like to try water sports or something. So I can mention how I tried surfing in Bali one time and I got a respiratory infection because the water was so dirty and full of garbage. Um, these resources can include assets defined as human capital, occupational skills, social capital, networks, and even cultural capital, tastes, and preferences. That's something where cultural capital, for me, again, Black privilege is, being Black American, I feel like I am part of the coolest club to ever do it. That's literally how I feel moving through life. And yeah, that can afford you negative things, but also it affords me a lot of great things as well, because so much of global culture, if the majority of global culture is built off of the basis of Black American culture. So even when people don't know it, I've gone abroad and people are talking to me using a term that I used when I was like 13, and they don't even know. They think that it's like just a word, and it's like, oh, they'll say a word that's like my parents used to use when they were my age or something, and they don't even know. And that's where that's cultural capital. That's cultural capital. And so a lot of this, I hope you also maybe can see ways in which you were naturally privileged, because also, yeah, I hope that you're not interpreting this as purely lack, because honestly, all I see in this is abundance. But I've also been really intentional with quite a few of these things. Well, with all of these things, right? Um, but all I see is abundance and ways for you to leverage your identity and your culture and your natural human interests um, into opportunities. The more interesting question is not whether leaders affect the stock of social capital. Hold on, so let me back up because he said something interesting in this piece, I remember. In addition, identity capital has the potential to be value added to social capital when it has a moral, ethical component in the form of a sense of reciprocity and obligation to contribute competencies to group goals, if only indirectly. Okay. The more interesting question is not whether leaders affect the stock of social capital, but what affects the stock of leaders. Meaning, I mean, yeah, meaning what came first, the social influence or the leaders, basically. Um, yeah, I can't say honestly. On the other hand, identity capital resources can involve choice, innovation, and investments in one's personal development. If the individual undertakes developmental individualization, this is what one would expect to occur more frequently in individualistic societies. On the other hand, identity capital resources can comprise duty, following norms, and investing in symbiotic relationships with others. This is what one would expect of people in more collectivist societies. What I took from this was that identity capital is prevalent in capitalistic societies. Although, again, identity capital I think is evident everywhere, but maybe how it's leveraged is more prevalent in capitalistic societies. Um, and what I took from this is I associate how he was talking about identity capital resources can comprise duty, following norms, and investing in symbiotic relationships with others. I hear that as boosting social capital. And then take it further. What I hear is that people like myself who have strong identity and social capital are able to thrive more globally because they're able to leverage both, and they address both types of societies, which are collectivist societies and individualistic societies. I don't know if there are other ones. I think there are only two types of societies, unsure, but that's what I took from that, which provides a lot of context because I do feel like I'm able to thrive globally, and I've never yeah, and I wonder if that's a big piece of why. Another thing that he said that was really interesting was it made me think of the male loneliness epidemic. Where is it? He said, in addition, those without sufficient identity capital or social capital are apt to experience identity problems associated with alienation, marginalization, and the like, where a significant proportion of the population is adversely affected in significant ways. And I thought of the male loneliness epidemic because really they're lonely because they're not good socialists, to be honest. They're not good at socializing, a lot of them. And again, similarly, as I mentioned, the man that grew up in or that's from this local environment, whatever, this locality in the States, and he moves abroad and he goes somewhere else and he starts talking. I was about people like, whoa, what are you saying? All related. Male loneliness epidemic. Um, okay, lastly, yeah, that's our last piece for now is again him talking about spaces and places. He says much of the work on social capital and its benefits is at the first order of place. And I'm really curious to explore. I'm going to think about it. It's like he says bridging social capital would involve identity capital invested and utilized across space through networks and with other groups. Bridging social capital would involve identity capital invested and utilized across space through networks and groups. Okay, that makes sense, right? It's like using your identity to enter the room, bridging social capital. Yeah, and then I like using your identity for the benefit of others, and then now you have a connection with that person, and so now your social capital is higher. That's what I take of it. The concept of identity capital can help in this regard by linking active forms of individualization with increased social dividends. Again, I'm really curious to know how we speak to, and I'm going to see if he has other things, other papers that are more recent, because I'm curious to know, how our definition of places and spaces change or adapt in a digital world. For example, is TikTok a space? Is Instagram considered a space now? It's up to us, I think, of course, to define that, right? Um, all right, I'm going to pause there. And if you're watching this on YouTube, me digesting this research paper is part of something called Safe to Be Seen. It's a personal practice. I have a link in the show notes. And in the next digest, if you are in Safe to Be Seen, and the next digest, we're going to talk about how to capitalize on these resources. The tyranny of choice is how it starts. I haven't started it. I left it for later. But in the next one, we're going to talk about different ways where he is has observed people. He mentions education for choice, tyranny of choice. Oh, education for choice. Okay, we'll leave it there. Until next time. And again, if you are interested, I'll find a link as well to this paper and I'll put that in the show notes, but it's called Identity Capital, Social Capital, and the Wider Benefits of Learning, Generating Resources Facilitative of Social Cohesion. That was a lot of words. At least for me, it was. Okay, ciao.